Welcome to the deep dive. We dig through the sources, find the key insights, basically give you that shortcut to being well-informed. Today, we are jumping into something dominating the headlines, sparking huge debate: the recent U.S. and Israeli strikes against Iran.
Yeah, and this is crucial stuff. We're looking at a really pivotal moment for Middle East security. The implications, they touch everything: global oil, international alliances, you name it. So our mission today is to figure out what really happened, why now, the potential fallout, and what different people are saying about where this goes next.
And we've got a pretty diverse stack of sources: geopolitical analysis, Reddit threads, economic reports, trying to get you that full picture. Because it's complex, it's moving fast, and the language used is, well, all over the place. You hear verge of catastrophe, terrible gamble, even least bad option. Let's try and unpack some of that. So first off, the why now. Talk of striking Iran isn't new. It's been around for decades. What specifically lined up to trigger these attacks?
That's a great question. What's really fascinating is how several factors kind of converged, creating this specific window. Firstly, you had President Trump's 60-day deadline for nuclear talks with Iran expire. And that basically removed a potential U.S. objection, the argument that Israel might be undermining a diplomatic effort. And this timing, it also followed a pretty unusual censure from the IAEA, the International Atomic Energy Agency. Right? They just flagged that Iran seemed to be taking steps to hide its enrichment activities more, maybe even speed up a weapons program. They even laid out how Iran was, and I'm quoting here, cheating, lying, and covering up their enrichment of plutonium and uranium to weapons-grade levels at Fordo in Iraq.
Okay, and if we zoom out a bit, connect this to the wider region, it feels like things really shifted after October 7th.
Oh, absolutely. Post-October 7th, Israel reportedly had, well, quite a bit of success using its own military capabilities against Hamas and Hezbollah, key parts of Iran's proxy network. So after a series of these surgical strikes, including some big ones in October and then April 2024 that took out a lot of Iran's advanced air defenses, Israel might have just decided, look, we have a window here and it might not stay open long, which raises that key question. Was this seen as just strategically necessary after years of, stalled talks and growing worry about Iran's plans?
Right. So given all that context, let's get into the strikes themselves. What exactly was hit? And what do we know about the damage?
Well, the U.S. actually joined Israel in what seems like a pretty sweeping series of attacks. American B-2s, the stealth bombers, they dropped those huge bunker busters, the GBU-57 MOPs, on Fordo. That's the nuclear plant built, way under a mountain like 80, 90 meters deep, supposedly beyond Israel's reach on its own. Natanz, the main enrichment site, was also hit, plus a site near Isfahan where they thought near-bomb-grade fuel might be stored. Although it's worth pointing out, the IAEA did say later those buildings hit in Isfahan had little or no nuclear material.
And it wasn't just the facilities, right? They also went after Iran's military leadership. Kind of a decapitation strike, almost.
That's exactly right. Early reports, the battle damage assessments, suggest Israel took out a lot of Iran's top military brass. We're talking figures like General Hossein Salami, the RDC chief, and Ismail Ghani, who leads the Quds Force. Sources say at least 20 other senior commanders were killed, plus a couple of nuclear scientists, and even someone from Iran's nuclear negotiating team. And on top of that, damage to drone forces, ballistic missiles, and whatever air defenses were left.
What's also really interesting, though, is what wasn't hit.
Yes, indeed. Very telling. Ayatollah Khamenei, other political leaders, major economic stuff like oil infrastructure, they weren't targeted. But sources are hinting those options are, quote, not permanently off the table. So maybe calculated restraint, maybe phase one of something bigger.
So the big question then, was this it? Did this knock out Iran's nuclear program for good?
That's the critical point, and it's not straightforward. Trump said the goal was to destroy their ability to enrich uranium for a bomb. But how much damage was really done at Natanz and Fordo? It's still a bit murky. There are definitely worries that maybe enriched fuel got moved out of Fordo beforehand, so Iran could potentially rebuild or even try a mad dash for a bomb. The scary part is, turning that 60% enriched stuff into weapons grade. You only need about 200 advanced centrifuges for maybe 3 weeks, and those could, quote, fit in a gymnasium, so concealment is possible. Most experts seem to agree it'd be very difficult to stop the Iranian nuclear program through military action alone. So the takeaway maybe isn't destroying the capability, but more like a major setback, a reset of deterrence.
Okay, so where does this leave Iran? Their military seems significantly degraded. That puts them in a really tough spot strategically.
Yeah, connecting the dots, their ability to hit back in a proportional way looks very much in doubt. And they've got huge internal pressure, too. Think about it. The economy is hurting, the military couldn't defend the country effectively, and all that money poured into the nuclear program might just be gone. That's got to be raising serious questions inside Iran. Some analysts are even suggesting Israel's goal might be to sort of create the conditions for the Iranian people themselves to overthrow the regime.
So if their conventional military options are limited, how do they retaliate? We saw some initial missiles, but what are the likely paths now?
Well, the thinking is they have little choice but to retaliate directly against the United States. Why? Because if they don't, they just look weak, like they could be bombed with impunity. So retaliation is seen as pretty much 100% certain. Our sources point to maybe three main ways they could go. First, hitting U.S. assets. You've got, 40,000 to 50,000 U.S. personnel scattered across at least 19 locations in the region. We've seen minor drone attacks on bases in Iraq before, called more of a warning, but with the U.S. directly involved now, that could escalate fast. Second, and this is a big one, messing with the Strait of Hormuz. That's the choke point where something like 18 to 21 million barrels of oil pass through daily. That's like 20% of global oil consumption, 30% of all seaborne oil. Iran's parliament is apparently saying closing it is under serious consideration, and they are highly skilled in asymmetric warfare. They've planned for this for decades. And third, they could unleash their remaining proxies, the axis of resistance, and potentially sleeper cells. Think Houthis in Yemen redoubling their missile attacks near the Red Sea entrance. Plus, the worry about activating Iranian intelligence cells globally for terror attacks, maybe taking hostages.
Okay, so a full-on war might be tough for them, but they definitely have these asymmetric, disruptive options. What about the nuclear program itself? Could they just double down?
They could. Leaders might escalate nuclear work, maybe even ditch the non-proliferation treaty altogether. But doing that would almost certainly invite a new round of U.S. and Israeli attacks, maybe hitting even more targets, possibly destabilizing the regime itself. So many think a more likely path is they'll double down on a covert effort, try to rebuild the program in secret, which, shifts the whole game from hitting military sites to this intense intelligence battle.
And this whole thing, it's not just contained to the Middle East, is it? It's sending shockwaves through the global economy, especially oil markets. What's the fallout we're seeing there? How does that affect, you, the listener?
Yeah, it's a huge geopolitical flashpoint for oil. We saw prices, WTI and Brent crude, jump nearly 7% in a single week, highest since, January 2025. And it's not just about actual supply being cut off yet. There's this risk premium, about $10 per barrel added just because of the uncertainty, the anxiety in the market. We're even hearing about an exodus of foreign oil personnel from some places in the region, which creates its own problems.
And the Strait of Hormuz, again, feels like that's the real pressure point for the global economy.
It absolutely is. It's the world's most important oil choke point. It's so narrow geographically, making it incredibly vulnerable. If it were completely blocked, oil prices could shoot up to 120, 150 per barrel almost immediately.
Yeah, there are alternative pipelines, but they handle less than half the volume that normally goes through the Strait ports. So for you listening, that means higher gas prices, definitely, more inflation across the board, potentially a significant economic slowdown worldwide. The rule of thumb is each $10 increase in oil prices reduces global GDP growth by approximately 0.2%. What about Iran's own oil exports? They're under sanctions, but are they still getting oil out? Has this impacted that?
Surprisingly, yeah. Despite everything, Iran has kept up pretty significant exports. Estimates are around 1.52 million barrels daily, mostly going to China and India. They've gotten good at adapting, using tricks like single tanker loading, moving storage around, using more ghost fleets ships that turn off their tracking to dodge sanctions and, potential targeting.
And how are the other big players reacting? I'm thinking Russia, China specifically.
That brings up this whole question of global alliances, doesn't it? Russia, China, Iran, North Korea, Western allies increasingly see them as this kind of new axis of authoritarian powers. They seem more aligned, more mutually supportive. Russia, predictably, strongly condemned the American strikes, called it a dangerous escalation, warned the U.S. off. Iranian officials are apparently talking to Putin. But Russia's own military is pretty tied up in Ukraine, limiting what they can actually do. And China, they rely heavily on Iranian oil. A Hormuz closure would push them towards Russia for energy, likely at astronomical prices. That could really impact their strategic thinking, maybe even on issues like Taiwan.
Wow. Okay, so this deep dive really shows just how layered and complex this all is. What are the ultimate stakes here? And what do all these conflicting views tell us about where things might actually go?
It's fascinating, isn't it? Especially how people define success. Some sources suggest setting back Iran's nuclear program another 20 years would count as a win, but others are adamant that military strikes alone just won't stop it. They argue, destroyed equipment can be rebuilt. It shows a fundamental disagreement about what military force can even achieve here. And it also throws that question about diplomacy into sharp relief. The U.S. told Iran to negotiate, right? But from Iran's perspective, the U.S. pulling out of the JCPOA, the old nuclear deal, basically shattered trust. They're less likely to believe coming to the table would accomplish anything.
Yeah.
Plus, there are claims Iran might have kept up some secret weaponization work even during the JCPOA, which just makes building trust even harder.
So the road ahead looks incredibly risky no matter which way you turn.
Absolutely. Some call this whole thing a terrible gamble with a high risk of entrapment. You hear echoes of the Iraq mistake. And sources point out, look, the 2003 Iraq invasion led to prolonged conflicts, regional destabilization, and that Iran is, 3 times as large as Iraq. But then you have the other side arguing, well, not striking doesn't do anything if Iran refuses to negotiate. So maybe this was the least bad option. It really shows that deep split on whether this kind of intervention is wise of Iran's leaders. They might try to bide their time, avoid escalating too quickly, given how vulnerable they seem right now, but not retaliating. That could destroy their legitimacy at home. Ultimately, what Israel did has, quote, fundamentally reshaped the security map in the Middle East. It's consolidated a more dominant American security infrastructure.
Yeah.
The huge unknown for you listening is whether this leads to some kind of new stable order or just a much more volatile situation.
We have certainly taken a deep dive into these U.S. and Israeli strikes on Iran today. We've looked at the reasons why, the immediate effects, the potential global consequences. It's clear this is just a tangled mess of geopolitics, military moves, economic forces, and deep-seated history.
So what stands out to you after hearing all this? Here's maybe a provocative thought to leave you with. In a world just flooded with information, how do leaders weigh that perceived immediate need for military action against the long-term consequences that are often, impossible to predict? Especially when nobody can even agree on what winning looks like for peace or stability down the road.
Hopefully you're leaving this with a much deeper understanding of this really critical global event. Thanks for joining us for this deep dive.